Recording.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Destreza lecture series. My name is Puck Curtis, and I'm here with my co-host, Eric Myers. And tonight, our speaker is Matthew Howden, Part 2. His first lecture was Destreza Saberwork from Frias, but he is also maybe the best Thibault resource in the United States for practical Thibault fencing. If there's anybody better, it would have to have been somebody that he trained, because I haven't met anybody else in the United States who can do what he does, both practically and with the theory and explaining it to people. And it was a long time ago, probably 15 years or more, but we taught at a K-War together, Known World Academy of the Rapier. And even though we had never really compared notes as far as fencing goes, it was like we had prepared the classes together. And that was a real good sign that I thought we were on the right track with what we were doing. So I'm really pleased to have him back. I'm really pleased that he's going to present this topic, which he has a lot of expertise in, and I will turn it over to him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Buck. So I'm going to keep the intro fairly brief on this, since it is my second time around, and I think a good number of the people who are in the audience for this particular episode were there for all the way back in episode 3. But I've been fencing now for since the mid-90s. A good deal of that has been within the Society for Creative Anachronism. And much as I love the saber work that I've been working on in recent years, I am first and foremost a rapier guy. And most of that since about 98, when we had just the first 8 chapters of Thibault to play with, has been either directly working with Thibault or working with resources that dovetailed into what Thibault was presenting and gave more information on why he was saying the things he was saying. So within the SCA context, I'm a member of the Order of the White Scarf. I'm also one of the handful of folks who has a laurel in historic combat arts and sciences. For those who don't do SCA, the Order of the Laurel is the top level recognition for research and the researching things, teaching things, making things type of aspect. So with that, let me go ahead and pull up the pages of Pretty. Okay. So
We can see it.
Cool. Okay. So, Ian, they're pretty close. All right, so this is Howden Lecture 2, Return of the Howden Lecture, because sure, why not? Got to have a little fun with it. So, let's talk Thibault. So, if there is, one of the things that makes researching Thibault a little bit interesting is that he was, and this is fairly common for the time, he was rather inconsistent about how he chose to spell his name. So, let me just, pardon me, I'm just doing a little bit of restructuring the screen here so that I can see everything I need to see. And apparently, they've changed some things and I can't see the comments, so we'll have fun with that. Thibault came from a very upwardly mobile, upper middle class family. Within one generation of Girard Thibault, they made the leap from merchant class to nobility, right? It didn't last very long, but it was a thing that happened. During his life, he was a wool merchant, he was a swordsman, he was an architect, a physician, a mathematician, and those are just the things we know about. We're definitely dealing with a bit of the model of, the archetypal Renaissance man when we are looking at this guy. Very, very well educated, very formally educated, and with a lot of the advantages in life, but unlike a lot of the Spanish Destreza masters, he doesn't have the noble titles. So he was born sometime around 1574 in Antwerp, son of Hendrik Thibault and Margaretha van Nespen. Studied fencing under Lambert van Sommeren. Now, we don't know a whole lot about what that training would have looked like, but you're probably looking, if you're familiar with the very brief work by Peter Bailey, there's some chance that it looks kind of like that, which is leaning a little more toward German school type of stuff. But that work is, of course, very, very brief and kind of difficult to draw a lot of conclusions off of. But it likely did not bear a whole lot of resemblance to Destreza. We know that as early as 1605, he was living in Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Now, most of what we know about Thibault's life, we have some deeds and records, and folks who have better access to that than I do have done a lot of this research. But we also have an article by Herman de la Fontaine Verwey from early 1900s, I think, originally published in Dutch. And that draws heavily on what Thibault wrote about himself in his Académie de l'Esprit, and from what was written about him in his Album Amicorum, which is basically a guest book. It's a book that people who like you would write things about you in, and then other people, when they came to your house, would see the nice things that people had written about you and go, this is a really cool dude, I should know him better and possibly pay him money to teach me things. Right?
Can I add a quick note about Sanlúcar de Barrameda?
Yeah.
This is the Destreza town. So it was the home of the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Mm-hmm. It was where Carranza's book was set when he wrote it, and he served there for a long time. So it really is probably in that time period the Destreza town.
Yes. And so we've got him living in Sanlúcar de Barrameda for probably around 5 years. He could have been there earlier. We're not entirely sure when he left, but we know he's back in the Netherlands in 1610. So part of why we know this is because he competed in the Netherlands in what is described as, or what Verwey describes as, a tournament. wherein he was, by all accounts, ridiculously successful. And he gets a whole lot of introductions to a whole lot of the who's who in and around the Netherlands, and this kind of puts him on a bit of a whirlwind tour for a while. It also makes him really kind of one of the really popular guys for all the fencers to know. In 1650, he begins commissioning engravings for his new fencing treatise. This would be the great work of his life, and he would not live long enough to see it published. The image of Thibault that we have here is one of the engravings from that book, and it was originally done by David Bailey, who was Peter Bailey's son, referring to that treatise earlier. So Thibault was in pretty poor health for his entire life. He was not a vigorous individual. He dies in 1628, and books 1 and 2 of his treatise are published right around 1630, even though they're still dated 1628. So I sometimes refer to Thibault's work as clickbait Destreza. And it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing because, I mean, seriously, this has to be one of the most clickbait titles you could possibly put together for a fencing treatise. Academy of the Sword, wherein is demonstrated by mathematical rules on the foundation of a mysterious circle. This, by the way, being the only point where he refers to it as the mysterious circle. The theory and practice of the true and heretofore unknown secrets of handling arms on foot and horseback. Now, the horseback part, just to add to the whole clickbaitiness of the title, the horseback part he never actually gets to. So, just like any good clickbait, you read all the way through the article where everything's really long-winded and elaborately worded and talking about secrets and all of this, and they never actually talk about the thing in the title. But we do know we do still get a lot of material. So looking at what we do know, some things we do know and some things we don't know. We do know that what was published was incomplete relative to what was advertised. As I said, he never got to the horseback portion. Also, book 2 is a lot shorter than book 1. So what we don't know is how much more he intended to put in there that he didn't. And given that this was published posthumously and it took a couple more years, we don't know to what extent his book may have been completed by his family, right, and by other people close to him. We also we have good reason to believe that the system that he's presenting is not strictly Dutch rapier. That it is likely not consistent with what was being practiced in the Netherlands. We don't know exactly what he learned before going to Spain, and we don't know to what extent von Sommeren's teaching influenced Thibault's presentation of the system. So how do we know that what Thibault was teaching wasn't what he learned from von Sommeren? Simply put, von Sommeren tells us that the system that Thibault presented after coming back from Spain was wildly different from anything anybody else was doing, including von Sommeren. And we have the interesting, may have been a conceit, may have been a reality, that where with when von Sommeren signs Thibault's Amicorum, or his album Amicorum, he identifies himself as now being a student of Thibault. Now, he may just be having a, and now the teacher becomes the student kind of moment. Or he may have been in earnest when he made that statement. It's very difficult to tell with these kinds of texts. We do know that the system Thibault presents visually looks like Destreza. You've got upright postures, you've got the sword being held out in guard of the right angle, you've got things that look like atajos going on. You have, if you have a practitioner who is doing stuff out of Thibault, and you have a practitioner who is doing stuff out of Rada or Pacheco, or one of any of the Spanish or Portuguese Destreza sources, I feel very confident that anybody looking on would go, yeah, those two are obviously related. Right? There's a distinct familial similarity. We do know that with him having spent several years in San Lucar de Barrameda, that he would have definitely had access to practitioners and teachers of La Verdadera Destreza. Right? What we don't know is to what extent he took advantage of that, who he may have studied, and whether, if we're going to call this Destreza, which I'm just going to give the spoiler alert and say I think we should. We don't know whether to look at his work as being an offshoot of the Carrancistas or the Pachequistas. We may, however, have a few clues. So Thibault doesn't directly use the word Destreza. Now, part of this may be due to the fact that he is not writing in Spanish, he's writing in French. And what we do have is some of the people who made entries in his album Amicorum making direct reference to Thibault and Destreza and true Destreza in the same breath, right? So we've got that. We also have him referring to what he is doing as the true art of handling arms, which to me seems like a pretty reasonable translation of the term, right? We do know that he was known to Destreza practitioners. And I basically ran out of brain power to re-hunt down the specific quotes on some of these, but Pacheco does have some colorful commentary to say about Thibault. I believe the phrase was "bastard son of the Spanish school," and something to the effect of "may his tome be consigned to the sepulcher of forgetfulness," or something to that effect. We know that we have some commentary about Thibault in one of Rada's works, where he seems to view. Yep, Lois is on the case. Where Rada seems to view Thibault or his work favorably. We also have, within the Amicorum, we have an inscription from Pedro Lopez, who identifies himself as a Portuguese student of Pacheco. And we have, in names that you might recognize, we also have an inscription by Luis Mendez de Carmona, who was rather vigorously a currencista. So I think we can draw a little bit of, it's a pretty weak case, but I think we can lean a little bit in the direction of going, well, Pacheco hated him, and he may or may not he may have been friends with Carmona. There is a non-zero chance that he's falling a little more on the currencista side than on the Pachecan side. It's a weak case, and I probably wouldn't want to attest to it in court, but it's kind of where I'm leaning. So let's talk about what's actually in the book. Pacheco, wow, really? Okay. Thibault's book is, or his system is strictly a single sword system. And Thibault is very adamant and salty on that point. We'll get a little bit of a quote on that later. But he divides all of the fights up into occurring between two characters, Alexander and Zachary. Alexander is the guy who's doing things the way Thibault wants them done. Zachary is everyone else. Right? So Zachary dies a lot. Alexander does die a few times with great and expansive apology from Thibault, showing that don't worry, it didn't really happen. We only did that to show an example of what Zachary was intending. Right? So Alexander is always fencing single sword. Zachary gets to play around with a few other things. Thibault's work makes allowances for both lethal and non-lethal types of exchange. He has a convention that he refers to as arresting with courtesy. And if we look at some of the Spanish Destreza sources where you have things like cuts being touched to the hat, or cuts and thrusts being touched to the brim of the hat instead of actually being shoved through the guy that you don't actually want to kill. This is along the same lines as what Thibault's talking about in terms of his arrests with courtesy, where he's either placing the blade in front of the face or in front of the chest. And there's a good chance that this was probably a tournament convention, given the lack of masks at this point in history. Most of the text for instructional purposes is like against like. So single sword against single sword, upright postures against upright postures, things like that. However, he does spend a whole lot of time, including the entirety of the second book, dealing with his system against things that are not like his system. He's got a couple of chapters, or he has some time devoted to fighting left-handed opponents. He has some time given to other weird ways of holding a sword and holding a guard, things like this. He specifically signals out Fabris and has a couple chapters where he, in all honesty, completely window shops Fabris's system and then tears it apart. So it's more of a straw Fabris, but it's. I don't think he really had a particularly good grasp of the system, but that doesn't make his approaches to it not entirely without merit. He takes single sword against rapier and dagger, rapier and shield, and by shield I mean the big rotella strapped to the arm, not some small, barely covers your hand buckler. We're talking full on disc shield, Captain America and sword. And he also takes on two-handed sword, and these things look a lot like Montantes. They are huge. And in one of the more enthusiastic and adventuresome sections, he takes single rapier against musket. And yes, we're talking loaded musket. No, he does not try to parry the musket ball. But we do have a really good example of a zigzag approach. So when in looking at how I've been how I approach the material, there's two quotes from the text that I want to read that I think kind of set this, for me it sets the stage on how to think about what's in the book. So it also sets the stage for thinking for understanding kind of what his voice as a writer is. So in this first one, he's talking about partially about why single sword is really all you need unless you don't know what you're doing. Right? It says this is also the reason why those who use these postures, recognizing their imperfection by experience, do not trust them more than halfway, having recourse to the assistance of a dagger. By this, they show clearly how little estimation and how little understanding they have of the great power of the sword, not knowing that it is sufficiently qualified all by itself to do all that is required, both in assault and in defense. But what can one say? It is hardly surprising if those who do not aspire to any science of arms, but try to succeed solely by long and continual exercises in quickness of the body and of the arm, by which they are able to prevail by anticipating and taking advantage of their opponents rather than by compelling them, not comprehending the secrets of so noble a weapon. All that they do is founded not on any reason of true and solid theory, but on simple and uncertain practice, so that to wish to compare their fencing to the true art of handling arms is just the same as to put the manual of mechanical works on the same level as the discoveries of mathematicians. The former are content to obtain the effects that they intend and nothing more, while the others state nothing for certain which is not founded on infallible rules. So, yeah. Well, he's certainly got a Pachacista mouth on him, that's for sure. Right, so if we're going to unpack that a little bit, I think a really big takeaway is that this idea that we have to be looking at this as rules and theory, not tricks and athleticism, which to my mind is about as Destreza as the attitude's going to get. Right? So Now, I want to contrast that a little bit with this next quote. But if it is a question of fighting in earnest, when one's life is at stake, there is no guard, high or low, long or short, no posture of the body, and no way of holding the sword, which is qualified by all possible advantages, and in which one ought to stop to await the attack. It is true that this book is full of postures of the straight line, but this is only for the sake of instruction. When it comes to practice, I would have our student abandon all this and hold as far as he can the same countenance and appearance as though he were attacking. Whether the enemy holds himself still in posture or advances or moves the sword about, let him continue always to move, using a free and natural pace toward one or the other of the two sides, avoiding above all the line of the diameter where the body of the enemy is drawn up, and holding perpetually as far as possible body, diameter, distances, and movements in inequality. For in order to fight well against the adversary, it is necessary to have the advantage, and in order to have the advantage, inequality is necessary, it being impossible that between equal things, insofar as they are equal, there should be any advantage. So when I look at these two together, yeah, doing what is necessary is historically accurate, yes. When I look at these two together, what I come up with is that the technical demonstrations, and there are a lot in Thibault, they exist primarily to clarify the discussions on theory. They are the application of the rules in given contexts. They are frequently simplified to present clear instructions and examples. So, for example, when Alexander goes to finish off Zachary, Zachary may not do any of 15 completely ridiculous things that might be possible simply to prolong the engagement. He might just let the hit land like we do in drills in frequent cases. Similarly, we have situations where Thibault tells us that he is showing us an example where Alexander is taking 3 physical steps of the foot in order to perform an action, but if you're actually doing it, you'll only take 1. So he's using some of these methods to break down the time and clarify the individual things that are going on. And perhaps most important to this, the technical demonstrations are descriptive of what he is having the people do. They are not prescriptive, meaning that if you are simply memorizing the hundreds of technical demonstrations that are in Thibault in order to have the ultimate catalog of what to do in any context, you're probably doing Thibault wrong. So practice should seek to follow the methods of decision-making. We're seeing contexts presented. We're seeing Alexander recognize things that Zachary is doing, make decisions, and form actions as a result of that decision-making process. So in a lot of ways, this is like studying a text on rhetoric, where we would take the time to read famous speeches and famous debates, not so that we can memorize the speech or debate to recycle it whenever we run into something that sounds vaguely similar, but so that we can understand the arguments that are being made and why those arguments were appropriate to the context, to learn how to better make arguments ourselves. The test of that is that the closer a context that we are in resembles a context that we see represented in the treatise, the more our answer to that is likely to resemble what is in the treatise if our decision-making process closely mirrors the decision-making process that Thibault is presenting. All right. So let's dig a little more into meat. So the weapon that Thibault is using is, I would classify it more as a early 17th century rapier than a late 16th century, more of the late 16th century style swords that we tend to see in like Carenza and Pacheco. So if in the older sources we're seeing something kind of like this with a relatively broad blade, pretty simple hilt, right? With Thibault, we're seeing a bit more of a slightly more of a built-up guard, although he has lots of salty things to say about your guard being too protective and how much of a coward that makes you look like. It is absolutely, we're dealing with a longer blade here. Thibault clearly lays out that the blade should be in proportion to the body. When you're standing upright, with the point between your feet, the cross should hit your navel. So given the dimensions of the circle and all that, that makes the length of the blade about 60% of your height. So at 6'4", I'm using about a 45, 46-inch blade if I'm using a blade that is in proper proportion to me, according to Thibault. And all of his arguments about this are about it not being too long or too short to do the work, right? So we've got a medio argument going on here. We've got some really fun illustrations here. We've got one of his examples of how you know your blade is too long is if you happen to be pinning a guy against a wall with your foot and you can't draw your sword and stab him with it without drawing the hand too far back behind your hip, then your sword is too long. Apparently that was a common scenario. I love the whole idea of just pinning somebody to the wall with your bare foot and stabbing them with a sword. Why not, right? Good Destreza. Likewise, if you are pinning them with your hand, you should be able to hold the hilt at your hip and hold the point against their chest. So he's going all city guard on this. And then if you are standing in the middle of your circle, you should be able to extend your arm and sword out and touch the circumference. So regarding your question, Ernesto, on the effect of the Netherlands, that if you're talking Spanish Netherlands, that probably would have been in effect. I'm not sure how local that was. Interestingly enough, so let me see if I can get this all in frame. If I place my guard at my shoulder, and we take that shoulder to fingertip measure as dynamic to the individual, this sword's a little bit short. It's a couple inches short for me, but we're in the ballpark of the 5/4 vara rule. So I think it's also worth questioning when they refer to the vara during the time of Philip II. When tailors of the time refer to vara, they're talking about a dynamic measurement. They're talking about a measurement that is scaled to the human body. And they're measuring with tapes. This is not going to come across the film real well. Kind of like this, which is actually a this is one of my vara tapes for 16th century tailoring, because a guy's got to have hobbies. So I've got some questions on that, but the guard that he's using is a basic AVB Norman Type 43, right? So you've got your couple of rings and a cross. He does tend to, as you can see in the illustrations here on the presentation, he's actually holding the sword what would be considered backward, with the inner guard on top and the outer guard on the finger side, which has to do with some fun things about how he draws his sword, which is I'm not really planning to go into in this lecture. And yeah, Puck, that would be an interesting thing to look at. I will be talking about Ettenhard a tiny bit, a little bit later. And by the way, just on the clickbait theme, at the end of the lecture, we'll be talking about spinning. and Thibault's twirly spinny actions. Thibault's grip is very interesting. So he actually has two different grips. He has one that he describes and says it's the only grip you should ever use. And then he later says, okay, now you're going to change your grip under these circumstances. Right? So that primary grip, again, that's what you're seeing in the illustration at the bottom. If you basically look at your single finger over grip and you roll this into the crease of the hand, you've got Thibault's primary grip. He's got the pommel in the break of the wrist. He's got the thumb up on the cross. He's got the index finger through the ring and pinching the underside of the blade. When he goes to cut, he simply drops that thumb under the coin, and you're in a basic one finger over grip. Now, the reason I bring this up is that the argument that he makes for his primary grip is it's a medio argument. What he is saying is that when you hold the guard or the grip or the sword in the standard grip, you have a strong side on the side of the knuckles and you have a weak side on the side of the thumb. So you don't have a balanced application of the weapon. By going to the primary grip, you have control of the weapon, which is very similar on both sides of the arm, even if the strong side isn't as strong as your traditional grip would be. And this is a theme that runs really, really strong through Thibault's work. Talking about things being balanced, things being proportionate, things being exercising the proper degree of restraint. So, guard and posture. Again, this is another situation. And yeah, Tim, the grip really takes a lot of getting used to. I personally find a lot of people who have a hard time using it are gripping too close to the, putting their thumb too close to the blade. In his actual description, he says on or against the quillin, and that gives much better control and versatility and makes it a lot more comfortable. But it definitely takes some getting used to. So the guard and posture is another thing where he says, okay, this is the one true way to do it, but then he later deviates from that as things progress. So I pretty much take when Thibault says, this is the one and only way you'll ever want to do this, as this is your default position that you will always touch back to. And if you are deviating from this, it will be with reason. Right, it's factory settings. So we've got, we're upright, feet are narrowly separated. They're definitely both feet under the hips, right? You should be able to shift the weight from one foot to the other without really moving the body too much. Back is straight, head is high, shoulders are relaxed, and the offhand, you've got this signature pointing down into the center of the earth thing going on. Now, an interesting thing that Thibault does, which to me resonates with the way that some of the planes are used in some of the other Destreza texts. Thibault does not talk about the planes the same way that you get in sources like Girard and Frias. But he distinguishes between the guard of the right angle and the posture of the straight line. So the guard of the right angle is the vertical angular relationship between the sword arm and the center axis of the torso. And Thibault goes to great lengths to really make sure you understand this point, so that if you are standing up and you lean the body down at an angle, that if you keep your arm parallel to the floor, you are actually going into an obtuse angle. But if you keep that right angle between the center axis of the torso and your arm, even though that lowers your hand relative to your shoulder, you are still in the guard of the right angle, according to Thibault. The posture of the straight line, on the other hand, is that having your hand and both shoulders in the profile plane, right? So draw one line, shoulder, shoulder, hand, one line, no joints. That is his posture of the straight line. Now, he frequently brings the left side forward when, surprise, surprise, he's moving to his inside line. So again, we're pretty consistent with Destreza sources on that. So we can't really talk about what's in Thibault's book without addressing the mysterious circle. Okay, so what we have here is Tabula 1, which has all of his introductions to why the circle that he has drafted is the greatest thing since sliced opponents. And so he's talking about how it relates perfectly to the proportions of the human body. There were some people a few years ago who put out a paper where they actually analyzed this mathematically against average human proportions and found out, and determined that his proportionate his proportions to human anatomy were just ridiculously accurate. So that's a bit of fun. Here we see some of the various examples that I pulled out earlier. But I want to talk about this in relation to other circles we see in Destreza. So, and yes, thank you, Tim. The front foot is turned, I would say closer to 30 degrees than 45, but you know, we're kind of splitting toe hairs on that one. It's really a matter of his, yeah, I know. His argument here is that people don't hold their feet at 90 degrees. You just don't. You walk around, you stop, you look down at your feet, they're not at 45 degrees. And if you try to turn it to 45 degrees, it does unnatural things to the body. So when we're looking at circles, there are a couple of different ways that the circle gets used in Destreza. We have Frias. His circles are a good example of the Destreza, the Destreza circle and the opponent's circle, right? And so in this representation, each fighter is in the center of their own circle, and when they are at the measure common defense, their opponent's circle is tangent to their own diameter, or their own diameter is tangent to their opponent's circle, and vice versa. Carranza has one here where he shows 3 circles, which, and I'd have to dig into this a little bit more, may be a representation of the 2 individual circles in the common circle, right? And then Edenhart, we have the common circle with a nice, what Thibault would call an inscribed square, and we've got our infinite lines, right? So Tamariz is working after Pacheco on this, and you can see a distinct similarity where they're both using that common circle. In this particular instance, it's augmented with the 9 medios proporcionados, which starts to look a lot like Thibault's circle, where Thibault is representing a common circle. He's got A for Alexander at one end and Z for Zachary at the other end. And essentially, there is nothing that Thibault is going to ask you to do in a demonstration that does not put you at an intersection. And so what this allows him to do is, unlike, if you extend, the question is, where are the lines of infinity on Thibault's circle? Basically, you'd have to draw them in at the circumference with, if you take the foot line, which is these small lines on the angle here, and extended those out, that would be your other set of lines of infinity. Thibault is not terribly concerned with that particular concept, and given the way that in a lot of ways is just I feel like in a lot of Destreza texts, the lines of infinity are kind of a throwaway reference anyway. It's oh, by the way, there's these things. Did you know that if you don't get any closer, you don't hit each other? Fun fact, people who don't get any closer don't get any closer. Moving on. Right? So I don't feel like that's a really particular particularly big thing for him to leave out. But where you've got, for example, Rada going, how many different circles can I throw at this? A lot of what I think Thibault is trying to do is take all of this, everything he's going to want to reference, and really ultimately condense it down into one single image that that the practitioner can just keep in mind. And I don't feel like I'm really trashing Rada tonight. I'm comparing and contrasting with a certain degree of vigor. To be fair, Rada has some really pretty circles. Does the guy with the musket have a really big circle? Actually, he's not shown on a circle at all, but arguably, yeah, I would say if you were going to draw that out based on relativity as measure, yeah. So another distinction between Thibault and a lot of the other Destreza sources is how he looks at time. In this sense, he's maybe a little closer to an Italian model. He doesn't have an equivalent to proprio, appropriato, and transferido. What he is doing, though, is he's taking that idea of movement and time being synonymous, and he is doubling all the way down on it. And a really good example of this is when he talks about stepping, about time in relation to stepping. Now, a quick thing to throw in here that's not on the slide. Thibault does, he is adamant about the use of pauses in the way that he manipulates time. And so he will begin an action and come right up to the edge of having to commit and hold for just a heartbeat and then commit. With the idea being that there are certain actions that your opponent cannot help but see, and that your opponent is likely to react to, hopefully in vigorous and ill-thought-out ways. And if your opponent is going to do something stupid, the best gift that you can give yourself and them is the opportunity to really do it, so that you can then punish them for their enthusiastic stupidity. Because if an opponent is going to do something stupid, there's at least some chance that they're also going to do something that you might not have predicted. If my opponent is going to do something that I might not have predicted, I would much rather be almost ready to commit than in the middle of the thing that their stupidity is about to intercept. Right? So when he's slicing this, he's basically slicing this at every point at which you could insert a pause. Yeah, never interrupt an enemy when he's making a mistake. Absolutely correct. And yeah. So in the simple step, Thibault breaks this down into raising the right foot, advancing the right foot while still in balance, lowering the right foot with the shifting of the weight. So this would be basically shifting the hips forward so that you start to fall off of the left foot, right? This is if you're taking a right foot step, right? Placing it on the ground. So there's the act of allowing the body to commit to the gravity of the step, and then there is the act of the foot actually taking the weight of the step. And that what Thibault refers to as the time after it has arrived, which I tend to interpret as that little gathering, that moment where it's on the ground and you're bringing your weight back up onto the foot. So the argument that Thibault is making here in his treatment of time is that at each of these points, my opponent has different ways that they can exploit my movement, or I have different ways I can exploit my opponent's movement. And if that is attempted, then the person who is moving has different things that their body is capable of, right? If I have raised the right foot, but I haven't advanced it, I'm still completely balanced. I can move to the other foot. I can move in pretty much any direction I want to. If I've advanced that stepping foot, but I haven't shifted my weight yet, I am slightly more limited in direction. I probably am still going to need to go in the half of the circle that the foot is directed in, but I still have a lot of options there. And with Thibault's system, I can do a lot of things with simply letting my shoulders come off of my center axis and falling in a different direction, catch myself with my foot and hit them, right? If once I've committed to the forward motion of the step, my options are even more limited. I'm now going to be limited to mostly actions of the hand, right? Redirecting where the blade is during my step. Once my foot is on the ground, my options go up again, but in a different way, right? I can choose to push back off of that foot and go back the way I was going. I can roll my weight onto the foot, pass forward with the other foot and go under their arm maybe. I can collect up and finish my step. I can move into a passing step, right? If we are in that moment when I'm finishing the step, but I haven't moved to the next thing, I'm a lot closer to the set of options that I was at originally when I was going to raise the foot. So the idea is that we're always thinking about what are the movements going on? What does that make easier for me? What does that make harder for me? And what does that make easier and harder for my opponent? Right? Boy, is there enough on that slide? Okay, we get naked butt guy. Divisions of space. This is going to put us back on some pretty familiar ground. Thibault has 3 pretty strictly defined measures that he uses. And he is using these largely as measures, although there is still some of that at least a nod to the idea that opportunity is an aspect of this. So first instance is our general sword in front of guard. You know, our measure of common defense. If somebody's going to hit somebody else, somebody's going to have to take a step first, right? This is where you start controlling the opponent's weapon, but you're not, in most cases, short of your opponent doing something large and dumb, you are probably not going to try to hit them from first instance because they have all the time in the world to stop you. This is where we're going to execute attacks on the blade and attacks on the position, right? Second instance, when I hear Puck talking about the that middle medio, second instance is what I think of. This is your goal in controlling the blade in first instance is to achieve second instance, where you have control and all that's left is for you to hit them. If I have solid control over your blade at second instance, congratulations, you are getting hit. Right? This is where when you make the Atajo and you've stepped into that Atajo and you can hit them without stepping, but you're going, as long as they don't move, right? You're going to have to extend to do it. This is second instance. Thibault measures this as arm extended, your point to your opponent's elbow, right? So this is where I am getting the disposition to attack. I'm going to launch my attacks from here. It's also close enough. If I have moved to second instance and my opponent tries to retreat, I can probably hit them anyway. Right? I'm just going to follow their retreat. I have enough extension from here that if I add a step to second instance, I am very much all up in their business. Third instance is, why haven't you hit them yet? This is if I'm standing in the guard of the right angle, my sword is right up by their shoulder. Really, all I have to do is fully straighten the arm, and I'm punching into stuff. Right. So there is some work that's done at third instance, but usually what happens, if we've gotten to third instance, somebody probably has a sword point in them at this point. And then Thibault likes to finish with, if we're fighting in earnest, he likes to finish with what he calls executing with rigor, which is that essentially as soon as the point is seated, he is more or less going to execute a lunge. So that rather than doing what he calls the cowardly thing of knocking their sword out of the way and retreating, he is instead going to, in most cases, he's got his sword bound on theirs. He's going to punch that straight into them and knock them over. And basically, if you want to get the afterblow on Thibault, you're going to have to get back up off the floor to do it. Right? So it is, you basically have Thibault fighting in one of two modes. He's either arresting with courtesy, or he is executing with extraordinary discourtesy. Right? And there really isn't a whole lot of in between. So how are we controlling the blade? A key aspect to a lot of Thibault's work is what he calls sentiment. This is not dissimilar to the idea of tacto or the German concept of Fühlen. Sentiment can be described in two basic ways. One is when the blades are touching, you can feel the beginning of the movement of your opponent's blade. Right? You can feel if they are increasing or decreasing pressure. You can feel if they are resisting or yielding. You can feel if they decide to break the engagement to try to cut you or disengage or whatever. Your hand notices that before your eye does. The other aspect of this, and there's a whole chapter where he lays out how to drill this and how to test this, and how to really hone your sense of it, is essentially mechanical potential energy. So if you think of a mousetrap, right? You've got a lever on a spring. You load the spring and you lock it out. When the mouse disturbs the lock, the spring releases its mechanical potential energy and snap, it comes over. So what one of the things that Thibault really likes to do is put structure against strength. So he'll line up behind the engagement while his opponent is trying to lever angularly, so that you have these situations where you go, no, push just a little more. Keep pushing. It's fine. Go ahead and keep pushing. And then you just simply break the engagement. You let their sword go over there. So when Thibault talks about his degrees of sentiment, he is talking about the amount of mechanical potential energy that is loaded into the engagement. Or in other words, if the one of us who isn't loading sentiment removes their blade, how far does the other guy's blade go before it stops? Right? And he's going to use that as a measure for essentially the size of an opportunity that would create. Now, in another thing that he does called obligation, Alexander is the one loading sentiment in, and he's creating a situation where essentially Zachary has taken control of the engagement. Zachary's got the Atajo, right? Alexander loads sentiment into the Atajo from below, but then he steps and raises his hilt so that Zachary can't hit him in the line that he's in. If Zachary wants to hit Alexander, he has to break the engagement, take the diameter, and hit. But Alexander has loaded mechanical potential energy into his blade and has his arm aimed at essentially where Zachary's face has to go. So when Zachary steps off, that point snaps around and Zachary gets Alexander's sword to the face. It's always fun to watch people's reactions when that works. But I've kind of skipped subjection here. Subjection, we really are talking about Atajo. And this is the tool that I want to use over and over and over and over again when I'm doing Thibault. My blade is above and across my opponent's. The line is closed. I have mechanical advantage, and I have my guard generally past their point. So when we look at definitions that say things like the Atajo needs to have subjection, deprivation, and opportunity, or disposition, right? You're pretty much dealing with Thibault's subjection. Now there are a few instances where Thibault presents dynamics where you have subjection and deprivation, but opportunity is removed by angle. And we'll get to those a little bit later when we talk about some of the spinny stuff. So what happens when the other guy doesn't let you have physical contact with their blade? Well, Thibault has an answer for this as well. And to me, this is one of the, it gives a really good place to go for talking about things like your virtual Atajo. So it's in one of Thibault's chapters on cuts, and in this case, he's talking about what to do if your opponent is cutting. Thibault doesn't throw a lot of cuts, but he still throws a fair number, right? But if your opponent is beginning a cut, they are necessarily breaking the engagement first. And so what Thibault has you do is, so Zachary comes in, he begins his cut. Alexander is going to take his point and he's going to direct it right above Zachary's hand, right above his sword hand. The idea being he's creating a line and saying you either have to cut to the inside or you have to cut to the outside. Pick one. Right? You don't get to do something that is some weird, funky mix of both. You're going to have to cut from one side or the other. As soon as Zachary's sword starts coming forward, Alexander is simply going to take the point and lean it over the top of the cut, and then follow the cut in, and he's creating a ramp with the blade. So he's not going to hard parry it. He's going to let the opponent's blade glide down his own until it hits the hilt. At which point Alexander has absolute full control of that blade. This works against cuts. This works against disengages. And it basically, in practice, it has become my absolute go-to anytime my opponent is not giving me engagement. My point is just directed a little above their hand. And as soon as their point comes up to where it's going to have to interact with the space that my sword governs, I just lean over the top of it and I let them just slide right into the strong. One of the pieces of advice that Thibault has is something to the effect of defend yourself in a way that in such a way that your opponent's attack is drawn to your hilt. So we're not chasing it with the hilt. We're just creating these little lines that all happen to lead back to where the guard is. Right? A very measured way to address that. So, Ernesto, your question is that adjusted if they are withdrawn or low instead of high? Not really. The one thing that I get out of it if they're low is I can actually point at their forearm. And a non-zero amount of the time, they'll bring their sword forward and just stab themselves in the arm. Right? So it doesn't really, it gets adjusted to where their hand is, but I'm not, for example, going to go below their guard instead of above it. The whole idea is that I'm putting the line of the blade in the general space where they are going to have to, they're going to have to pass near it. John, the question, it's also adjusted if there's a dagger, I believe. Yes. So this is one area where when you start getting the dagger and the shield involved, in that case, the adjustment is that I'm going to work more aggressively to either one side or the other so that they can either use the sword or they can use the dagger or shield, but they can't use both. In which case, I'm going to basically, with the dagger, I'm going to basically cover the dagger a little more than the sword if I'm on the dagger side. Okay. So I've been talking a lot about the idea of rules. Now, one of the things, so Thibault is many things. Concise is not one of them. So in trying to take this down to a fairly simple set of guidelines that end up looking like Thibault at the end of the day, the first thing is, if I've got control of the diameter, my opponent has the harder job, right? 100% of the time. If I can control the space in between me and my opponent has to work harder. So first order of business, control the diameter. Yeah, not many 16th century Catholics were. Yeah, not many 16th century Protestants were either. Thibault is very much an academic, and he writes like an academic of his time. And he pretty much flat out states in his in the early parts of his book that he's giving an academic treatise, that he's essentially presenting a proof. So so don't commit to any action that's out of proportion to your opponent's degree of commitment or the action they've taken, right? I mean, this is a basic medio argument. Observe the medio, act according to the medio. Stepping, he actually explicitly lays this rule out, right? If you've got engagement with control, now I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting here. If you have engagement with control, step in the lateral direction that the engagement is in close measure. If I have a Tahoe on the inside, I'm stepping to the inside. If I have a Tahoe on the outside, I'm stepping to the outside, right? If I've got advantage, I might as well get closer because I can hit you faster from there. Okay. If you don't have engagement with control, so there's two aspects there. One is engagement and two is control. Don't step toward the point, right? Step away from the point. Put distance between you and the thing that hurts, right? So this is some basic, this is some basic rat and electrode level reasoning, but it works, right? So if my opponent has the advantage, if my opponent has the Tahoe and I'm on the outside line, and they're sorted, and their point is directed at me, I have two options here. I'm either going to step, if the point is far enough to my inside, I'm going to step to the outside and obligate. If it's narrow, I'm going to graduate the engagement. So I'm going to I'm going to bring my hilt closer to the blade, and I'm going to step under it, right, and get to that other side. But I'm not going to simply leave the blade where it is and step toward where the point is. So this is where you see things like one of the early plays. Alexander and Zachary are lined up. Zachary pretends he's going to thrust to the inside. He instead thrusts to the outside without any kind of engagement, and I can simply step to the inside and poke him in the face while his point is over there. If I get the engagement as he's bringing it up, now I have advantage. I instead step across his blade, and I essentially do a glide thrust to the face. Right? Those rules are pretty consistently applied throughout the system. So if I have the engagement, if I've got the engagement with advantage, I'm probably intending to do something with it, right? I've got an Tahoe on the inside line. I'm going to be doing something that is not utterly dissimilar from one of the generals. If my opponent's hand is around shoulder height, I'm going to take the Tahoe across. I'm simply going to lower the hand and point and stab him in the flank, right? If I have the subjection in my outside line, I'm probably doing what is essentially a glide thrust to the face. Those are sort of the default settings. So there are 5 basic things my opponent can do with that, and pretty much everything's going to be some degree of one of these 5. 1, they can just completely fail to act. In which case, my proper course of action is to continue my plan and hit them. Right. The second is they resist. Right. So I get the subjection, they push against the subjection. Assuming that it's not enough of a push to immediately steal the subjection from me, my response to that is to simply increase angle into their push. That's going to create a slope that forces everything down toward my hilt, gives me advantage, and I proceed from there. Right? If it is enough that it overpowers what I'm doing, then we're back into our stepping rules, and I'm going to be moving into obligation, or I'm going to release and let sentiment fling their sword, halfway around the circle, and I'm going to disengage and probably stab them in the flank or something. But I'm going to use that force that sentiment that they had to load into the system to overpower me. If my opponent yields to the engagement, so this is just a softening of the engagement. This is, if we think about I engage my opponent in the high outside line, and they simply soften a little bit to let that come through, but I'm not real sure where they're going with that. At this point, Thibault is going to throw he's going to throw a glide expulsion into that. He's going to say, if you're not going to make up your mind, I'm going to make it up for you. You are breaking the engagement, and now I'm going to hit you. Right? So we do have that fun little glide expulsion in there to send their sword flying. If they completely leave the engagement, I have to assume that they're either cutting or disengaging. Right? My response to that is my entire guard goes to the center. Now, if their hand goes into some really obvious cut, I'm going to my cut response. But otherwise, if all I have is the breakaway, my guard goes to center, and if I've got the time to do it, straight down the middle, and we're hitting them. And then the last option that they can take is some form of retreat. In which case, since I'm launching these actions from second instance, the form of that retreat will usually be one of those first four. Or if it's really, really big, I let them have the retreat and we start again. And this is basically the mode that we get through a lot of Thibault's material. So with those sets of rules, we're almost done here. We can't talk about Thibault without talking about spinning. I feel like Puck would probably be very disappointed if I didn't.
I personally would.
What about let them pass? I'm not understanding that question. But okay, so spinning. There are four basic times when Thibault does big rotational actions. Now, the big thing that is going to control, or that's going to lead to a rotational action, is needing to put my body someplace and not having my weight on the foot that would take me there without rotating. Since we are basically doing a walking system, he's not really going to tend to change which foot has the weight unless he really, really, he's not going to take that moment to shift weight so that he can go into that thing that he only has that much opportunity to take advantage of. Instead, he's going to let his body rotate to do the work. So with that, there's four basic kinds of spinning actions. There are control actions, redirection actions, pass-through actions, and what I'm calling rotational preservation actions. So control actions are things like your movements of conclusion and Thibault's what Thibault calls the entries inside the angle, which we've got a lovely picture of here, where Alexander has bound up Zachary's sword, done a nice little rotation, and shoved the sword all the way through his flank. So these are actions where I begin and end with control of their sword. I have control of the sword. I'm bringing the left side forward so that I can get my empty hand involved. No, Zachary doesn't look too upset about that. I'm guessing that by this point in the book, he's just really resigned to his fate. He's died, many dozens of times over by this point, and so, I have a sword through my gut. It must be Tuesday. Redirect actions. So this, you're basically dealing with your what in the Italian schools we'd be talking about as incartadas and intagliatas, right? So this is usually an action where my opponent's sword is being carried off by momentum, and I am doing some combination of avoid and strike, right? Pass-through actions. So these are those scenarios where all my opponent did something that is extreme enough that even though I have safety, because I'm controlling their blade, and my blade is in a position where they can't hit me in that line. I've achieved deprivation, but I don't have disposition. And if the weight is on the wrong foot, or it would take too much time to break that back, like for example, what we have here in the top picture, if Alexander breaks that engagement to stab or cut Zachary, he also needs to put space in between himself and that sword, because he's going to have to free the sword to hit it. So in this case, he's going to do one of two things. He's either going to rotate under that blade to put himself on Zachary's other side, or he's going to, in this case, he's going to pass underneath Zachary's arm, and he's going to throw a cut down across Zachary's legs and then pivot back again to cover. And these rotational preservation actions are a similar thing. In this case, we've got Alexander has thrown a cut to Zachary's face. This is an outside to inside cut. He's also stepping outside to inside. So when he's done with that cut, he's going to have his back to Zachary. So just in case Zachary isn't quite dead enough, Alexander is going to do a rotational action that preserves the inertia, the rotational inertia of his movement, and brings him in the most direct way back to facing Zachary so that he can bring his sword into defense. Right? So a lot of these rotational actions are really artifacts of the high stance that Thibault is taking, and the fact that he's using that walking method instead of constantly resetting, for example, the right foot forward or things like that. And he's working really close, so those actions are getting very, very dynamic. All right. Hopefully that has not been too much of just an overwhelming info dump. I tried to keep it fairly structured. I know we've covered some questions along the way, but at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop just wantonly flapping my yap about this for the moment and open things up to questions.
All right, so can you guys hear me? Yes, good. Okay, but this particular text has a lot of technical depth, and there's a lot of, like, I think Matthew's looked at this pretty closely. So this is a good time to get in with those questions. So let's see what you guys have got.
I tried to ask this in text, but he didn't understand me. So there's a thing that I do fairly often, most notably in response to an oblique lunge. I've heard the phrase "let it pass." I thought it was more universal, but basically you've got like an oblique lunge or something else that is putting a lot of force into your sword. And you basically let your wrist go limp and you bring your hilt under the blade so that their point shoots past you and your hilt is now between you and their blade at an angle. And usually what I then do is do a cross step and stab them in the back with my dagger is the most common what I'll do. But you were talking about if your opponent reduces or softens their blade. And my thought is, you talked about if they soften it a little. What is he saying to do if your opponent softens their blade a lot? Basically, you're trying to go a direction, they're sending you that way and coming past you. Trying to close sort of, I mean, I know that takes my point offline, so for it's taking the point offline, but basically coming up the side of the blade that's the other one than you were engaged. How does he respond to that?
Okay, so basically there's a couple of points there. One is the idea of how to respond with the blades, with the sentiment reducing but not removing. That rule basically applies regardless of degree, provided that you had the control to begin with and are in a position to throw the glissant or that glide expulsion. If you have that, that's what you're going to do. If you're talking about a situation where your opponent are you talking about a situation where your opponent has control of, or your opponent has control of the engagement and they throw a lunge from that, and so you reduce?
I'm talking about a situation where the opponent takes control by reducing. In Italian terms, they're letting all the energy, the impulse, go the direction it is already going.
Okay.
But the which side of your sword just suddenly changed. It's not a disengage, but it's got that same effect of the disengage, and you keep going. It's a cut under, but
okay, so more of a transport. Okay, so in that case, where you'd be largely outside of those four rules, you'd be into more of a situation where if you had put sentiment into the engagement in order to control the blade, they yield and move to the other side. Now you're either going to be taking your step defensively or you're going to be moving into obligation to put the pressure there. Now,
can you specify how obligation applies in that situation?
Well, obligation applies in the same way as essentially, in this case, it's going to be yielding to a hanging guard. right? Raising the hand into a hanging guard to put your blade in the way, and then exerting pressure into their blade. That said, there's a lot of variables there. And that another situation that Thibault would likely use there is to simply body void with something like an incartata, and take that off cast to the point, turn it into a cut, and cut him in the back of the head. I'm speculating a lot because there's a lot of technical nuance that can go into that. But in general, those would be the kind of things that I'd be looking to do in that situation.
Okay, I'm looking at what his counters are to what I'm doing a lot, which it definitely didn't sound like he was expecting.
I would say if you are frequently running into a situation where you are attempting to place the subjection and the other person is yielding and it's causing your sword to move offline, you're probably putting too much force into your subjections, and you're probably carrying them further past the center point than they ought to go.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So that is what I would look at. So this is a situation where I think we want to be careful to address the cause rather than focusing so much on the symptom.
That makes sense. I'm much more addressing the thing that I do, what is Thibault's reaction to what I do, than the other way around. But thank you. You've now answered the question. It took about 3 times to get through, to translate between us. Thank you.
Well, that's okay. That's how this works, right?
Right.
So, John, does Thibault address acometimiento in any way? Okay, so sort of. So he isn't really big on the idea of provoking a response in order to draw specific reaction. There is an implicit recognition that every action we take will have a response, but it's more going to be expect your opponent to respond in some way and be aware of how you will need to address it. He does have a section where he talks about feints, but he's talking about it in terms of receiving the feint. And the main argument that he's making here is an argument of scale, where he talks about feints that don't pass the guard, feints that pass the wrist, and feints that pass the middle of the forearm. Now, he doesn't define what he means by a feint, but the way that he describes it basically means it can basically be interpreted as any action up to the point where they commit. And the basic way that he addresses that is that if their point has not passed your guard, so what? Nothing to worry about. If their point, once their point passes your hand, you're going to prepare to cover it. So you're going to shift your weight, you're going to raise your point, but you're not going to commit to the line. And once the point reaches about the middle of the forearm, you're done playing, and you're going to take control of their blade at that point, and you're going to punish them for their hubris. In traditional LVD, this lifting of the hilt in response to the adversary's Tahoe is called movement reversion. Yes. Does he ever step along the circumference? Yes. There are, I will say it is just because of how close the circumference is to the circumscribed square, it often doesn't really matter if he's stepping across along the circumference or stepping along the circumscribed square in most cases. But yes, there are definitely some points where he has you stepping along the circumference, but he's always having you step to intersections, and he's pretty much always having you step to lettered intersections. So it's one of those things where the distinction is, it tends to be technically irrelevant.
So I have a question.
Sure.
You've used this in bouting somewhat in lots of different circumstances. Can you talk about your experience with that and maybe touch on how tough is it to put this into somebody's body? So you've fenced with this system. I think you've done pretty well, and you've also taught students to use it. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So the biggest challenge in fencing with it is that a lot of people, for a lot of reasons, really don't like to engage the blade. So a lot of using Thibault in practice in, for example, an SCA environment doesn't tend to look a lot like Thibault until the end of the play. Because you're spending a lot of time working those virtual actions and taking actions to try to compel the person to bring their sword into an engagement play. If I can get them to engage, we're going to start looking a lot like the pictures, and it's going to be fun, right? And the hardest part for me in learning to really apply this was that step of really digging into how do you get your opponent to give you their blade so that you can hit them properly. That said, I will say that probably one of the single most used tools in Thibault is the engage inside, yield to the counter parry, stab them in the ribs, or engage inside and take that flank thrust over the top. Those I've gotten to the point where I can hit those with pretty good regularity. As far as putting it into other people's bodies, it's tough. It's really getting their head into the right place so that they are doing Thibault without doing Thibault choreography is, I think, the real challenge. And it's one of the reasons why I've spent so much time really, really trying to boil it down to a concise rule set and then playing with the nuance within that. I think at this point, I think it's a lot easier for me at this point to do that than it was 10, 15 years ago when I was still trying to build that tool set out. Because it's one of those things that when you're approaching it as a technical guide to fencing, you're going to get really good at teaching students how to be overwhelmed by the catalog available to them. And the biggest challenge in teaching has been getting past the idea of how do I teach this as a technical art, and into the idea of how do I teach this as a reasoning and movement art. And we simply, from a fencing perspective, we do not have as many good, tested, codified guidelines for how to teach a primarily reasoning and moving art that results in technique as we do for how to teach a well-developed technical art that is driven by reason. If that distinction makes sense?
It does, because I can see people being overwhelmed with like just the sheer number of plates, and they've got plates and plates stacked up.
Well, I mean, that was a big part of Edgerton Castle's argument against Destreza, right? Is it's wildly overcomplicated. I mean, and specifically against Thibault, it's this wildly overcomplicated thing. How could anybody ever learn it without, and because he's looking at it as a technical art. Now, his idea that people stab each other by a jerking motion of the arm was also quite comical. But we get a lot of those, when I was first starting to work with Thibault, all we really had was the book itself and opinions that were very, very clearly arrived at through some pretty cursory window shopping. And so it's taken a lot of time and effort to really get at something where I felt like I could start to say, maybe I might be fencing Thibault now. Right? I find that I'm occasionally there.
I think a lot of us feel that way. Although not with Thibault.
Matthew, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we see in Thibault similar types of discussions to some of the things that we see in other Destreza manuals, like discussion of causes, for example, or propositions and things like that?
Yeah. So the basic format, the basic structure of each of Thibault's chapters is that he essentially posits an idea at the beginning of a chapter and says, here is this thing that we're going to say is true. Right, and here's this argument for it. And then he has a number of exercises where he's talking about, this is the context that's being created, this is what Alexander sees, and this is what he perceives, and this is how he goes about shaping his answer to the causes in front of him. He doesn't tend to use the word causes. But that's the discussion that's happening, is he's saying this is how he shapes his technique to this context. And then at the end of the chapter, he says, so having looked at these exercises, this is the argument again, and this is why the exercises prove the argument, is essentially what's going on. So in terms of the question of, do we see that in his book? That discussion, in my opinion, is literally what his book is. It's just happening in some ways. I mean, he's got, my God, the first chapter is so dense with philosophy. He's having an absolute torrid love affair with his academic credentials. But then once he really gets into it, a lot of his discussion, we do see a few points where he really gets into some of these things where he's like, we could do it this way, but we're not going to do it that way because that would be philosophically false. Or we could do it this way and we would have a good philosophical argument for it, but practically it doesn't hold up. and what we're doing needs to do both. So in a lot of ways, I think I view this as being a philosophical proof of his system laid out in practical examples. Yeah, so Puck, as far as the I could do that, but it would be philosophically false. That's actually his argument for obligations. Is he's like, yeah, so my opponent took control of my blade. I mean, realistically, I could just retreat and start over, but I believe the phrase is a person who a person who begins rightly has no need to revisit how they're doing things. It's basically, okay, yeah, I started this right. I'm on the right path. This guy thinks he's got advantage right now, but I'm not going to back off because I wasn't wrong. And now I'm going to prove it to you.
That's like every Facebook conversation I've ever had.
Yeah. One of my other favorite ones, a great thing about Thibault, he also addresses combat psychology. So he has this whole section on how to draw the blade. And it basically starts out with this idea of, so as often happens when you're in the break room getting coffee, arguments turn to matters where somebody's going to just have to stab somebody. Right. And so he gives two different ways of drawing the sword. One is drawing the sword while moving forward, and the other is drawing the sword while moving backward. And he says that while it's not advisable to retreat because it's going to, if you should reach the end of words, it's not advisable to retreat because your opponent's going to think they're winning, right? They're going to be emboldened by your retreat. You may already be too close to draw your sword, so you need to get some space. So here's how to draw your sword while retreating in a way that very clearly lets them know they're not in charge. And so he's got a nice cutting flourish that he does as the sword's going out.
We are almost at half an hour past our normal allotted time, and I'm really glad that we've gotten extra time. But I also feel like maybe we need a third lecture from you, like Rise of Circle Walker.
The Howden trilogy.
That's right. That's right. Let's circle back, see if there are any last questions before we let our speaker go and everyone can get some sleep.
Absolutely.
All right, I don't see anybody typing. So we don't have a speaker for next week, so Eric and I will host a Destreza chat. You're welcome to come, and we will come up with some topics, and we can argue about Destreza a little bit. Maybe we should talk about Thibault next week. Who knows? Okay, thanks everybody for coming. I hope you're staying safe, and that things are settling down a little bit in the various crisis things that we have going on. And thanks to Matthew. It's been really great getting a chance to work with you over the years, and of course, the Thibault lecture has been wonderful.
Well, thanks. I've definitely enjoyed it. Looking forward to more.
Yeah. All right. Thanks everybody, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, everyone.
Good night.